Silence filled the council chamber like thick smoke. Every representative from every known world sat frozen in their seats, staring at the holographic display that showed nothing but empty space where something massive should have been. Admiral Koros of the Drakari Empire cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the curved walls like a death rattle. "It is gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. Shadowclaw, the most feared war dragon in the galaxy, had simply vanished. The hologram flickered, showing the last recorded image from the fortress world of Grimhold. There sat Shadowclaw in its reinforced containment chamber, 30 feet of pure destructive power with scales that gleamed like black steel and eyes that burned like dying stars. The creature's massive form filled the chamber, its wing membranes folded against its body, plasma vents along its neck glowing with contained fire. Then the image went dark for exactly 3 seconds. When it returned, the chamber was empty. "How?" demanded Counselor Beth from the Human Federation, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Nothing that large just disappears." Admiral Koros activated another display showing the fortress itself. Grimhold was a planet-sized military installation, bristling with enough weapons to level small moons. Its defenses could stop entire fleets. The containment facility sat at its heart, protected by energy shields that could withstand planetary bombardment. No alarm sounded, Koros explained, his clawed hands trembling slightly as he manipulated the controls. No energy signatures were detected, no breaches in the containment field. Our most advanced sensors recorded nothing unusual. Shadowclaw was simply there one moment and gone the next. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives jumped to their feet, shouting questions and accusations in dozens of languages. The Velkan delegate hissed something about Drakari incompetence. The crystal beings of Zephyria rang like bells in their distress. Even the usually calm ethereals flickered between visible and invisible in their agitation. Through it all, Admiral Koros stood silent, his reptilian features carved from stone. He had commanded war fleets that conquered entire systems. He had faced down rebellions and crushed uprisings. But nothing had prepared him for this moment, for having to admit that his empire's greatest weapon had simply vanished without explanation. "Search protocols are already in effect," he continued when the noise died down. 7 sectors have been locked down. Every ship, every station, every populated world is being scanned. We will find Shadowclaw. But even as he spoke the words, doubt crept into his voice. Shadowclaw was not just any war dragon. It was the first, the prototype. The perfect fusion of Drakari biotechnology and pure destructive instinct. Created in the deepest laboratories of the Empire, it had been designed for one purpose: to end wars before they could truly begin. Its very existence had prevented countless conflicts, as no sane government would risk facing such a creature in battle. Now it was loose somewhere in the galaxy. The implications hit the delegates like a cascade of falling stars. If Shadowclaw had been stolen, whoever took it now possessed enough firepower to threaten any world. If it had somehow escaped on its own, it might be acting on instincts that recognized no friend or foe. Either way, billions of lives hung in the balance. "What are its capabilities?" asked the Thorian representative, his rocky features grim with worry. Koros hesitated. Much of Shadowclaw's design was classified, known only to the highest levels of Drakari command. But with the creature missing, secrecy seemed pointless. "Shadowclaw can tear through starship hulls with its claws," he began, the words falling from his lips like drops of poison. "Its breath weapon generates plasma at temperatures exceeding 15,000 degrees. Its scales can deflect most energy weapons. It can survive in hard vacuum for extended periods. It requires no life support systems." Each specification sent another wave of horror through the assembled delegates. This was not just a weapon. It was a force of nature given form and purpose. And its intelligence? Beth pressed. "Enhanced beyond normal dragon parameters," Koros admitted. "Shadowclaw can pilot starships, operate complex equipment, and execute sophisticated battle strategies. It was designed to function independently for extended missions." The chamber fell silent again as the full scope of the crisis became clear. Somewhere in the vast galaxy, a creature with the intelligence of a tactical genius and the destructive power of a small fleet was roaming free. It could strike anywhere at any time and no conventional defense could stop it. Emergency protocols activated across the galaxy within hours. Trade routes shifted away from border regions. Military fleets repositioned to protect major population centers. Bounty hunters and mercenaries began gathering on frontier worlds, drawn by the enormous reward the Drakari had posted for information leading to Shadowclaw's recovery. Meanwhile, on the remote human colony of New Haven, Dan Miller wiped grease from his hands and stepped back from the atmospheric processor he had been repairing. The settlement's main air recycling unit had been making strange noises for weeks, and he had finally tracked down the problem to a worn bearing in the primary compressor. New Haven was exactly the kind of place most people forgot existed. Too far from major trade routes to be profitable, too small to be strategically important, too peaceful to be interesting. The colonists were mostly farmers and miners, simple people who wanted nothing more than to work their land and raise their families in peace. Dan preferred it that way. At 42, he had seen enough of the galaxy's conflicts during his time in the Colonial Defense Force. When his tour ended, he had come to New Haven specifically because it was the kind of place where a man could fix things without anyone asking too many questions about his past. His repair shop sat on the edge of the settlement, a rambling collection of metal buildings surrounded by piles of salvaged equipment and spare parts. He specialized in the kind of unglamorous work that kept frontier colonies running, fixing water purifiers, repairing mining equipment, maintaining the generators that powered everything from homes to communications arrays. As he locked up his tools for the night, Dan glanced at the comm unit on his workbench. It had been buzzing with emergency broadcasts all day, something about a missing alien weapon and increased patrols in nearby systems. He shrugged and switched it off. Whatever was happening in the wider galaxy, it had nothing to do with him or New Haven. Behind his shop, something large moved through the darkness of the scrapyard, leaving no sound but the whisper of metal shifting against metal. The sound woke Dan from a restless sleep at 3 a.m. Metal grinding against metal, followed by a heavy thud that made his small cabin shake. He rolled out of bed, pulled on his work clothes, and grabbed the plasma torch he kept by the door. Living on the frontier taught a man to be prepared for anything, from equipment thieves to the occasional wild animal that wandered too close to civilization. The noise came from behind his shop, somewhere in the maze of salvaged parts and broken machinery he had accumulated over 5 years of running his repair business. Dan moved carefully through the darkness, the pale glow of New Haven's twin moons casting strange shadows between the piles of scrap metal. Another sound reached his ears, softer this time. It reminded him of the noise an injured animal might make, a low whimpering that spoke of pain and exhaustion. Dan's irritation faded, replaced by concern. Wild creatures sometimes sought shelter in his scrapyard, and he had treated his share of wounded animals over the years. He rounded a massive pile of old ship plating and froze. The plasma torch nearly slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers as his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. Something enormous lay collapsed among the twisted metal and discarded equipment. Even in the dim moonlight, Dan could see it was easily 30 feet long, with a sleek, powerful build that spoke of predatory grace. Scales covered its body like black armor, each one perfectly formed and gleaming with an inner light. Massive wings were folded against its sides, the membranes torn and bloody. A long serpentine neck ended in a head that belonged in nightmares, all sharp angles and glowing amber eyes. Any rational person would have run. Any sane individual would have contacted the authorities immediately. Dan Miller did neither. Instead, he found himself taking a step closer, drawn by something he could not name. The creature's breathing was labored, its great chest rising and falling in an irregular rhythm. Dark fluid leaked from several wounds along its flanks, pooling beneath its body and mixing with the oil and coolant that perpetually stained the scrapyard floor. One wing hung at an unnatural angle, clearly damaged during whatever ordeal had brought it here. Dan had spent enough time around hurt animals to recognize the signs. This was a creature at the end of its strength, possibly dying. The predatory lines of its body, the weapons-grade construction of its claws and teeth, none of that mattered in the face of obvious suffering. "Easy there," he said softly, the same tone he used with nervous farm animals. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature's head turned toward him with startling speed, those amber eyes fixing on his face with an intelligence that made Dan's breath catch. For a moment, predator and human stared at each other across 10 feet of cluttered ground. Dan could see the wariness in those ancient eyes, the expectation of violence that spoke of a hard life. Then the creature's head lowered back to the ground, as if it had assessed him and found him wanting as a threat. Dan found that reaction oddly insulting and reassuring at the same time. Moving slowly, he approached until he could see the wounds more clearly. Plasma burns, by the look of them, partially healed but infected. The torn wing membranes were the work of sharp metal, probably from forcing its way through some kind of barrier. This creature had escaped from somewhere, and someone had tried very hard to stop it. "What happened to you?" Dan murmured, pulling the medical kit from his belt. He always carried basic supplies when working with heavy machinery, never knowing when someone might need patching up. The creature watched him with those unsettling eyes as he cleaned and dressed the worst of the wounds. It never moved to attack, never so much as growled a warning. If anything, it seemed to relax as Dan worked, the tension slowly leaving its massive frame. By the time the suns rose, Dan had done what he could with the injuries. The creature would need proper medical attention, the kind that required equipment he did not have and expertise he did not possess. But the immediate bleeding had stopped and the infected wounds were at least clean. "I need to get you some real help," he said, sitting back on his heels and studying his unexpected patient. "But first I need to figure out what you are." He had seen pictures of various alien species during his military service, but nothing like this. The craftsmanship of its biological construction spoke of advanced genetic engineering, the kind practiced by only a few species in the galaxy. The Drakari were known for their bioweapons, but their creations were typically smaller, more specialized. This creature was something else entirely, something that had been built for a purpose Dan could not fathom, then abandoned or escaped to die in his scrapyard. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, earning what might have been an amused snort from the creature. "Well, neither am I originally. Sometimes life just carries you to strange places." As the morning progressed, Dan found himself talking to his unexpected guest while he worked on routine repairs in the shop. The creature seemed to enjoy the sound of his voice, responding with soft rumbles that almost sounded like conversation. When Dan emerged with fresh water in a large container, it drank gratefully, those intelligent eyes never leaving his face. By afternoon, Dan had made a decision that would have horrified anyone who knew him. This creature, whatever it was, needed help. And Dan Miller had never been the kind of man to turn away from something that needed fixing, whether it was a broken generator or a wounded animal. He spent the rest of the day arranging his scrapyard to provide better shelter, moving large pieces of metal to create a hidden space where his patient could rest without being seen from the settlement. The creature seemed to understand what he was doing, actually helping by moving smaller pieces with careful precision that belied its size. As evening fell, Dan sat on a crate next to the makeshift shelter and opened a ration pack for dinner. The creature watched him eat with obvious curiosity, its head tilted in an almost endearing manner. "I suppose you have a name?" Dan said between bites. "Though I don't suppose you can tell me what it is." The creature made a sound that might have been an attempt at communication, a complex rumble that carried notes of what almost sounded like language. Dan found himself wishing he could understand. "How about I call you Rex?" he suggested. "You've got the bearing of a king, even beat up like this." The creature seemed to consider this, then made another rumbling sound that Dan chose to interpret as approval. For the first time since the midnight discovery, Dan allowed himself to smile. "Rex it is then. Now let's see about getting you properly healed up." 3 days passed before Dan truly understood what he had gotten himself into. Rex was not just intelligent. The creature possessed a mind that grasped concepts with startling speed and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that put most humans to shame. The revelation came when Dan was struggling to move a massive coolant tank that had fallen off his loader during routine maintenance. The tank weighed nearly 2 tons, far too heavy for his aging equipment to handle safely. He was rigging a complex pulley system when Rex simply reached out with one clawed hand and lifted the entire tank as if it weighed nothing, placing it exactly where Dan needed it. "Thanks," Dan said automatically, then stopped to really look at his companion. Rex had positioned the tank with millimeter precision, accounting for the clearance needed for the connecting pipes and the angle required for proper drainage. This was not the action of a simple animal following instructions. This was the work of an engineer. Over the following days, their partnership deepened in ways Dan had never expected. Rex learned to anticipate his needs, passing him tools with careful precision and holding complex assemblies steady, while Dan worked on delicate repairs. The creature's claws, which could easily tear through starship hulls, handled electronic components with the gentleness of a master craftsman. More importantly, Rex seemed to enjoy the work. The creature would position itself where it could watch Dan's hands as he worked, those amber eyes tracking every movement with obvious fascination. When Dan explained what he was doing, talking through problems the way he always had when working alone, Rex would respond with soft rumbles that sounded remarkably like questions or comments. See? The problem with these old atmospheric processors is they use mechanical seals instead of force fields, Dan explained while replacing a worn gasket. Cheaper to manufacture, but they fail after a few years of operation. Now, if you were designing this from scratch, you would use a containment field generator here. Rex made an inquiring sound, and Dan found himself sketching a rough diagram in the dirt beside his workbench. To his amazement, Rex studied the drawing intently, then used one claw to add a line that corrected a flaw in Dan's design. "You're right," Dan said after a moment of consideration. "That would improve the efficiency by at least 15%. How did you—" He trailed off, staring at his companion with new understanding. This was not just an intelligent animal. This was someone who understood engineering principles, someone who had been educated or trained in technical disciplines. The implications sent a chill down Dan's spine. But before he could pursue that line of thought, the sound of approaching vehicles reached them from the direction of the settlement. Rex immediately tensed, his great head swinging toward the noise with obvious alarm. Without thinking, Dan moved to place himself between Rex and the approaching sounds. "It's okay," he said quietly. "Probably just a supply run from the city. Stay calm." But Rex was already moving, retreating deeper into the scrapyard with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for something so large. Dan watched in amazement as the creature found a hiding spot that concealed its bulk completely, becoming invisible among the shadows and twisted metal. The vehicles turned out to be exactly what Dan had thought, a convoy of supply trucks making their weekly delivery to the settlement. He went about his business normally, accepting a shipment of replacement parts and chatting with the drivers about the weather and crop yields. All the while, he was acutely aware of Rex's hidden presence, of the trust the creature had placed in him by remaining concealed instead of fleeing. When the trucks departed, Rex emerged from hiding with what Dan could only describe as a sheepish expression. The creature seemed almost embarrassed by its reaction, as if it regretted showing fear. "Nothing wrong with being careful," Dan said, running his hand along Rex's neck in what he hoped was a reassuring gesture. The scales felt warm and smooth under his palm, like polished stone heated by the sun. Sometimes it pays to stay out of sight. That evening, as they worked together on a broken water recycler, Dan found himself sharing stories of his past. He told Rex about his time in the Colonial Defense Force, about the battles he had seen and the friends he had lost. He talked about the decision to leave military life behind, about the peace he had found in fixing things instead of breaking them. Rex listened to it all with obvious attention, occasionally making soft sounds that seemed to express understanding or sympathy. When Dan described particularly difficult moments, the creature would move closer, offering comfort through simple presence. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Dan said as they finished the repair. "My old sergeant, actually. Guy named Roberts. Smartest person I ever met. But he'd been through hell before the service. Had this way of watching everything like he was always expecting trouble." Rex made a questioning sound, and Dan found himself explaining about military life, about the bonds formed between soldiers who depended on each other for survival. As he talked, he realized that was exactly what was developing between him and Rex, a partnership based on mutual respect and trust. The pattern continued for days. Rex proved invaluable as an assistant, his strength and intelligence making difficult repairs almost effortless. But more than that, Dan found himself enjoying the companionship. Living alone had been his choice after leaving the military, but he had not realized how much he missed having someone to talk to, someone who listened without judgment. Meanwhile, the galaxy beyond New Haven continued its frantic search for the missing war dragon. Emergency broadcasts updated the bounty daily, now reaching astronomical sums that would make entire worlds wealthy. Mercenary fleets scoured empty systems while military patrols interrogated every ship and station. The search had become the largest manhunt in galactic history. Dan heard fragments of these reports on his comm unit. but they seemed as distant and irrelevant as news from another universe. He was too busy working with Rex, too focused on their growing friendship to pay attention to galactic politics. Besides, what could a missing alien weapon possibly have to do with a mechanic and his unusual assistant on a forgotten frontier world? One evening, as they sat together watching New Haven's twin moons rise over the settlement, Rex did something that stopped Dan's heart. The creature began to make sounds that were unmistakably speech, complex vocalizations that carried the rhythms and patterns of language. Dan could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear in the creature's posture and expression. Rex was trying to tell him something important, something about who he really was and where he had come from, something that might change everything between them. But before Rex could continue, the distant sound of atmospheric entry reached them from the night sky. High above, something was burning through the atmosphere, with the distinctive signature of military descent pods. Rex's entire body went rigid with fear, and Dan felt his own stomach drop as understanding finally dawned. The search for the missing weapon had finally reached New Haven. Dawn brought visitors that changed everything. Dan watched from his workshop window as sleek military vehicles rolled into the settlement, their dark hulls bearing the distinctive markings of the Drakari Empire. Soldiers poured out in perfect formation, their movements precise and deadly efficient. At their head walked a figure that made Dan's blood run cold. Commander Voss stood nearly 7 feet tall, his reptilian features carved from living stone. Ceremonial scars marked his jaw and temples, speaking of battles fought and won. His uniform was pristine black with silver trim, and the weapons at his side were clearly meant for killing rather than intimidation. Rex had vanished at the first sign of the approaching ships, disappearing into the scrapyard with a speed that belied his massive size. Dan tried to act normally as he went about his morning routine, but his hands shook as he organized his tools. Whatever Rex really was, whatever he had done, the Drakari wanted him back badly enough to send their best soldiers to a forgotten frontier world. The interrogations began within the hour. Voss and his team moved through the settlement with methodical precision, questioning every colonist about unusual sightings or disturbances. Dan heard the fear in his neighbors' voices as they denied knowledge of anything out of the ordinary. New Haven was a peaceful place where people minded their own business and asked few questions. When they reached his shop, Dan was replacing the power coupling on a mining scanner, his movements deliberately calm and measured. He looked up as Commander Voss entered, flanked by 2 soldiers with weapons at the ready. Dan Miller, Voss said, consulting a datapad, former Colonial Defense Force engineering specialist. Settled here 5 years ago after an honorable discharge. That's right, Dan replied, not looking up from his work. Something I can help you with, Commander. Voss studied him with eyes like chips of yellow ice. We are searching for a missing asset. Extremely dangerous. It may have sought shelter in isolated areas away from populated zones. Haven't seen anything like that, Dan said truthfully. He had seen Rex, but dangerous was the last word he would use to describe his gentle friend. The asset in question is a bioengineered war form, Voss continued. 30 feet in length, reptilian features, enhanced intelligence. It was last detected in this sector 3 weeks ago. Dan's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. Sounds like something I'd remember seeing. Big as my shop, you said? One of the soldiers moved to examine the repair bay, his scanner sweeping across the walls and floor. Dan forced himself to continue working, even as sweat beaded on his forehead. The concealed bay where Rex often rested was directly beneath the soldier's feet, hidden behind a false floor panel that Dan had installed years ago. You live alone out here, Voss observed. No neighbors for several kilometers. The perfect place for a fugitive to hide. Perfect place for a man who likes his privacy, Dan corrected. Gets plenty of that out here. The scanner beeped and Dan's blood turned to ice. But the soldier was looking at a pile of old power cores in the corner, their residual energy signatures masking whatever readings he might have gotten from below. These are highly radioactive, the soldier reported. Sensors are useless in this area. Voss's expression darkened. How convenient. Search the premises manually. Every building, every storage area, every piece of equipment large enough to conceal our target. For the next 2 hours, Dan watched helplessly as Drakari soldiers tore through his life's work. They dismantled equipment, overturned storage containers, and probed every space that might conceivably hide something Rex's size. All the while, Dan knew his friend was less than 50 feet away, hidden in the one place the soldiers had not thought to look. But Voss was not satisfied with the search results. As his troops reported negative findings, the commander's suspicions seemed to focus more intensely on Dan himself. "You served in the Colonial Defense Force," Voss said as they stood in the main workshop. "Engineering specialist. You would know how to hide things from military scanners." "I would also know better than to hide something that could get me killed," Dan replied. "I'm just a mechanic, Commander. I fix things. Nothing more dangerous than that." Voss circled him slowly like a predator evaluating prey. "Our asset has been missing for 21 days. Long enough to travel to this system. Long enough to seek shelter with someone sympathetic to its plight." "Don't know what plight you're talking about," Dan said. "But if something that dangerous was loose out here, don't you think the colonists would have reported it?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps someone with military training might see opportunity where others see only threat." The accusation hung in the air between them like a drawn blade. Dan met Voss's stare without flinching, calling on years of military discipline to keep his expression neutral. "I think you've been chasing shadows too long, Commander," he said finally, "making you see conspiracies where there's just a man trying to make an honest living." For a moment, Dan thought Voss might arrest him anyway. The Drakari's hand moved toward his sidearm, and the soldiers tensed in response to their commander's mood. Then Voss stepped back, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps you are right, but I will be leaving observation teams in the area. If your dangerous asset appears, we will know about it immediately." Dan nodded as if this was perfectly reasonable. "Hope you find what you're looking for, Commander." After the Drakari left, Dan waited a full hour before activating the hidden panel in his workshop floor. Rex emerged slowly, his great form moving with obvious distress. The creature's eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of old fears and older pain. "It's okay," Dan said quietly. "They're gone. For now." But even as he spoke the words, Dan knew they were living on borrowed time. Voss had not been convinced by his performance, and observation teams meant constant surveillance. Sooner or later, Rex would be spotted. When that happened, Dan had no illusions about what would follow. The Drakari had not traveled across the galaxy to negotiate. They had come to reclaim their property, and they would kill anyone who stood in their way. That evening, as the twin moons rose over New Haven, Dan sat with Rex in the hidden shelter he had created among the scrap metal. The creature seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, the way safety had transformed into deadly peril in the space of a single day. "You're what they're looking for, aren't you?" Dan said softly. "This war dragon they keep talking about." "That's you." Rex made a sound that might have been confirmation or might have been sorrow. In the moonlight, Dan could see the intelligence in those amber eyes, the weight of terrible knowledge and unbearable choices. "I don't care what you were before," Dan said, placing his hand on Rex's neck. "I care about who you are now. And right now, you're my friend. That's all that matters to me." But even as he spoke the words, Dan knew that friendship might not be enough to save either of them from what was coming. The hunt was closing in, and soon they would have to make a choice that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everything they had built together. In the darkness beyond the settlement, Drakari surveillance equipment turned its electronic eyes toward the scrapyard, where a mechanic and a war dragon shared their last peaceful night together. The surveillance net tightened around them like a closing fist. Dan could feel the electronic eyes watching from hidden positions throughout the settlement, tracking every movement and recording every sound. Rex had not emerged from his hiding place in 2 days, sustaining himself on the emergency rations Dan smuggled to him after dark. On the third morning, Dan made a decision that would have terrified anyone who knew him. He could not bear to watch his friends slowly starve in the darkness, could not stand to see the light fading from those intelligent amber eyes. If they were going to be captured anyway, at least Rex deserved a chance at freedom. The old mining charges in the hills had been left behind by the previous survey team, forgotten explosives from New Haven's early prospecting days. Dan had always meant to dispose of them properly, but frontier life had a way of pushing such tasks to the bottom of a very long list. Now those same charges might be the key to Rex's escape. Dan waited until noon when the settlement was busy with lunch preparations, and the Drakari watchers would be focused on routine activities. He slipped out through the back of his workshop, carrying a small device that looked like routine mining equipment, but was actually a remote detonator he had built from spare parts. The charges were exactly where he remembered them, buried in a shallow cave system 3 kilometers from the settlement. Dan set the timer for 30 minutes, enough time to get back to Rex, but not enough for the Drakari to track the source of the distraction. When the explosion shook the hills like a small earthquake, every soldier in the area responded exactly as Dan had hoped they would. Emergency protocols activated as the surveillance teams raced toward the apparent threat. Their sophisticated equipment focused on the growing dust cloud that marked the blast site. In the chaos that followed, Dan opened the hidden bay beneath his workshop and helped Rex emerge into daylight for the first time in days. The creature moved stiffly, weakened by confinement and lack of food, but his eyes burned with desperate hope. "There's a canyon system about 10 kilometers north," Dan explained as they moved through the scrapyard. "Plenty of caves and water sources. You could hide there until things calm down. Maybe find a way off-world on one of the cargo ships." Rex made a sound that Dan had learned meant disagreement, a complex rumble that carried notes of refusal, and what might have been affection. The creature was not interested in fleeing alone. "Don't be stupid," Dan said, though his voice was gentle. "I'm just a human. They'll question me and let me go." "But they came a long way to find you. They're not going to give up." But Rex was already moving toward the edge of the settlement, staying low among the salvaged equipment and abandoned machinery. Dan had no choice but to follow, his heart hammering with fear and a strange kind of pride. Whatever Rex had been before, whatever terrible purpose he had been created for, the creature had chosen friendship over survival. They almost made it. The canyon entrance was visible in the distance when Commander Voss stepped out from behind a massive boulder, flanked by soldiers with weapons trained on both of them. The trap had been perfectly executed, using Dan's own rescue attempt to flush Rex into the open. "Did you really think we would not anticipate such a simple stratagem?" Voss asked, his voice carrying cold amusement. Former Colonial Defense Force engineering specialist. Predictable tactical thinking. Dan found himself standing between Rex and the soldiers, knowing it was useless but unable to stop himself. Behind him he could feel Rex's tension, the creature's muscles coiling for an attack that would end in death for them both. "Stand down, human," Voss commanded. "You are harboring stolen military property. Surrender now, and your sentence will be merely imprisonment rather than execution." "His name is Rex," Dan said quietly. "And he's not property. He's someone who deserves better than being a weapon." Voss studied him with those reptilian eyes, genuinely puzzled by such a concept. "It is a bioengineered war form, a tool created for specific military applications. It has no more individual identity than a starship or a plasma rifle." Dan felt Rex shift behind him, heard the soft sound that might have been pain or might have been rage. Without thinking, he reached back and placed his hand on the creature's neck, offering what comfort he could in their final moments. "You're wrong," he said to Voss. "Rex thinks and feels and chooses. He could have killed me a dozen times over, but instead he helped me fix water recyclers and atmospheric processors. He listened to my stories and shared his own pain. That's not a tool. That's a friend." The soldiers tensed as Rex began to move, expecting the massive creature to attack in a final desperate bid for freedom. Instead, Rex did something that shocked everyone present, including Dan himself. The war dragon carefully, gently lowered his great bulk to the ground. His massive head came to rest near Dan's feet, and slowly, deliberately, Rex curled his body around the small human who had shown him kindness. It was a gesture of protection and surrender combined, an unmistakable statement that he would neither flee nor fight. "Fascinating," Voss murmured, though his weapon remained trained on them both. Shadowclaw chooses to protect the inferior species rather than preserve itself. The conditioning protocols were clearly flawed. "His name is Rex," Dan repeated, though his voice shook with the knowledge of what was coming. "And this isn't conditioning. This is choice." Voss activated his comm unit, speaking in rapid Drakari to his superiors. Dan caught fragments of the transmission, enough to understand that this development was both unexpected and significant. The galaxy's most feared war dragon, choosing protection over violence, was not something the Drakari Empire had planned for. As they waited for Voss to receive his orders, Dan knelt beside Rex's great head and spoke in the gentle tone he had used during those first days in the scrapyard. "I want you to know that this meant something," he said quietly. "These past weeks, working together, talking together. It meant something to me, and I hope it meant something to you too." Rex made a sound that was unmistakably an attempt at human speech, Mangled by vocal cords not designed for such sounds but recognizable nonetheless, the creature was trying to say his name, trying to offer comfort in return for all the kindness he had received. Dan, Rex managed. The word barely recognizable but filled with more emotion than Dan had heard in any perfect speech. It was then that Commander Voss received his new orders, instructions that would change the fate of both the War Dragon and the human who had befriended him. As Voss listened to his superiors, his expression shifted from cold efficiency to something approaching uncertainty. The galaxy, it seemed, was watching, and what they were seeing was forcing even the Drakari Empire to reconsider what they thought they knew about weapons, tools, and the power of simple friendship to transform the most unlikely hearts. The image spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Someone in Voss's unit had left their comm channel open, transmitting the scene to Drakari Command, where it was intercepted by intelligence networks and news services throughout known space. Within hours, every civilized world had seen the same impossible sight. Shadowclaw, the galaxy's most feared war dragon, curled protectively around a single human mechanic. On the bridge of the Drakari flagship, Admiral Koros stared at the transmission with growing horror. Emergency councils convened on a dozen worlds as the implications became clear. If Shadowclaw could choose friendship over violence, what did that say about every other bioengineered weapon in the Drakari arsenal? On New Haven, Commander Voss found himself facing a situation his training had never prepared him for. His orders were simple: retrieve the War Dragon and eliminate any witnesses. But those orders had been issued before the galaxy began watching. Before the story of a mechanic and a dragon became the most watched news event in recorded history. "My superiors wish to speak with you," Voss said to Dan, activating a holographic communicator. The image that appeared made Dan's breath catch. Admiral Koros himself materialized in the canyon, his scarred features grim with the weight of galactic politics. "Human," Koros said without preamble, "you have created a significant problem for my empire." Dan struggled to his feet, Rex's massive form still curled around him like living armor. "I didn't create anything, Admiral. I just helped a friend who needed it." "That friend is a military asset worth more than your entire world," Koros replied. "It was designed for a specific purpose, trained for precise applications. What you call friendship is merely programming malfunction." But even as he spoke the words, Koros could see the flaw in his argument. Programming did not account for the gentle way Shadowclaw positioned his massive claws to avoid harming the human, or the obvious distress the creature showed when soldiers moved too close to his small friend. "Look at him," Dan said, placing his hand on Rex's neck. "Really look. Does this seem like a malfunction to you?" Rex responded to Dan's touch by making a soft rumbling sound, a note of contentment that carried clearly across the comm channel. It was the sound of a creature at peace, despite being surrounded by armed soldiers and facing certain capture. Across the galaxy, the transmission was being watched by billions of beings. On the Human Federation worlds, crowds gathered in public spaces to witness this unprecedented display of interspecies friendship. The crystal beings of Zephyria rang like bells in harmonious approval. Even the usually cold ethereals flickered with what might have been emotion. But it was on the Drakari worlds that the real impact was felt. Other war dragons in military facilities began showing signs of agitation, as if responding to some signal their handlers could not detect. Reports flooded in from across the Empire, bioweapons refusing orders, enhanced soldiers asking questions about their purpose, entire units standing down without explanation. "The conditioning is breaking down empire-wide," reported General Thack from the Military Command Center. "Every enhanced unit is exhibiting signs of individual thought. Some are demanding to know why they fight. Others are simply walking away from their posts." Admiral Koros closed his eyes, feeling the weight of centuries of military doctrine crumbling around him. The Drakari Empire had built its power on the premise that intelligence could be enhanced without creating true consciousness, that weapons could be made smarter without becoming truly alive. Shadowclaw and the human mechanic had proven that premise catastrophically wrong. "What do you want?" Koros asked Dan, his voice heavy with defeat. "I want Rex to have a choice," Dan replied simply, "about what he does, where he goes, who he serves. The same choice any thinking being deserves. And if he chooses to leave with you, to abandon his military purpose, Dan looked down at Rex, meeting those intelligent amber eyes. Then that's his choice to make. I won't force him to stay any more than you should force him to fight. The moment stretched across space and time, watched by a galaxy holding its collective breath. Then Rex moved, lifting his great head to look directly into the holographic image of Admiral Koros. When he spoke, it was in heavily accented but unmistakable Drakari. I choose the human, Dan, Rex said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I choose peace over war. I choose fixing things over breaking them. I choose friendship over duty. The words hit Koros like physical blows. This was not malfunction or programming error. This was conscious choice made by a being capable of understanding the consequences. Shadowclaw was not just intelligent. He was alive in every way that mattered. The Galactic Council is demanding an emergency session, reported another aide. 17 species are calling for immediate sanctions against bioweapon programs. 3 more are threatening military action if we attempt to retrieve Shadowclaw by force. Koros looked at the image of his empire's greatest weapon, curled protectively around a simple human mechanic on a forgotten frontier world. The irony was not lost on him. They had created Shadowclaw to end conflicts through overwhelming force, but in the end, it was the dragon's choice of peace that would reshape the galaxy. Commander Voss, Koros said finally.
Stand down your forces.
New Haven is hereby declared a neutral zone under Galactic Council protection. Voss's expression showed his shock, but he was too good a soldier to question orders. Sir, are you certain? The strategic implications are already in motion, Koros replied. The age of bioweapons is ending, Commander. Perhaps it is time we learn to win wars through different means. As the Drakari forces withdrew, Dan found himself sitting in his scrapyard with Rex, watching the twin moons rise over New Haven, just as they had on countless peaceful nights before. But everything had changed. Representatives from dozens of worlds were already en route, wanting to study this unprecedented bond between species. You realize you're probably the most famous dragon in galactic history now, Dan said, scratching behind Rex's jaw ridge in the spot that always made the creature purr. Rex made a sound that might have been amusement. Famous dragon, unknown mechanic, he said in his improving human speech. Good partnership. Dan laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. Yeah, I suppose it is. Though I have a feeling our quiet life is about to get a lot more complicated. Complex repairs need good team, Rex observed, settling his bulk more comfortably in the space they had made among the salvaged equipment. We are good team, yes? The best, Dan agreed, leaning back against his friend's warm flank and watching the stars appear in the darkening sky. Across the galaxy, other war dragons were making similar choices, walking away from military service to seek their own paths among the stars. The Drakari Empire would survive, but it would have to find new ways to project power. New methods that did not depend on enslaving intelligent beings. And on New Haven, a mechanic and a dragon continued their work together, proving every day that the strongest force in the universe was not weapons or technology, but the simple willingness of different beings to treat each other with kindness and respect. The galaxy had learned an important lesson from the most unlikely teachers, that even the fiercest hearts could choose peace when offered genuine friendship, and that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies but from making friends.